Hi, hello, my name is Trina. If you're new here, welcome. If you're not new here, then welcome back. We're in a slightly different format today. We're sitting at a table because I want to reference my laptop because today I'm going through the books I read in 2024, but specifically books that I consider highly overrated and books that I consider highly underrated. To clarify that distinction, I would say I'm mostly going off of number of Goodreads reviews, which is not at all like an accurate system, but I'm also throwing in some books that I've just never heard mentioned for the underrated and books that I've heard mentioned a lot for the overrated. So obviously this is somewhat subjective. This is not an exact science, but I thought it was a fun concept nonetheless, so we're going for it. My voice sounds a little bit funny today. It's the morning, so I'm still warming it up and I'm recovering from a cold, so apologies for that. And before we get into anything, I just want to say that you are allowed to enjoy books. Remember, it's important to remember you are allowed to enjoy books. Reading is for fun, so if you had fun reading any of the books I talk about today, then they're not overrated for you. That's why overrated and underrated, while I'm trying to use reviews to make it like scientific, is still a subjective category, very much subjective. And I imagine because of the number of reviews some of these books got, then they're not overrated for a lot of people. And that's just the nature of things. But we're using this format to go through books because I read somewhere between 157 and 163 books this year. Goodreads was off with counting, but somewhere in that range. So I can't talk about all of them. I've already talked about my favorites by genre, so go check out that video if you haven't yet, if you want to see a fully positive video where I'm just talking about books I love. But I also wanted to be able to talk about some of the books that I didn't love so much in 2024. So I'm using this like format in order to get into those. But yeah, as always, take my opinion with a grain of salt. I use my favorite booktubers for a lot of things, but a lot of times they get things wrong. A lot of times I hate books that my favorite booktubers recommend, and a lot of times they hate a book that I love, and I'm like shocked and horrified. It's a marketplace of ideas that we're all just contributing to. But please feel free to share in the comments if you strongly disagree or strongly agree with any of my overrated, underrated. But first, I'm gonna go grab some tea for my voice, and then we'll get started. Okay, I could not find a coaster, so we're putting the cup of tea on a pack of sticky notes, and we're all just gonna pretend that that is right. Let me start with the negatives. Get them out of the way, get the rants out of the way so I know how long this video is going to be before I get into the good stuff. And let's start with my most overrated books of 2024. Not all of these books were 1-star books. I think I only rated 3 books 1 star this year. So I rarely give out that low of a rating. Like if a book did not fill me with like incandescent rage, then it usually gets at least 2 stars. It's only books that really piss me off that get 1 star. And the very first book is one such book. The very first overrated book that I read in 2024 is Butcher and Blackbird by Brynne Weaver. This book is one of the reasons why I wanted to make this video, because people love this book. Like even people that don't like read dark romance that often love this book. It has almost 400,000 ratings on Goodreads with a 4.05 star average, and I gave it 1 star. So if you don't know this book is a romance between 2 serial killers, awesome concept, where basically the 2 of them run into each other while trying to take down the same person. But of course, in order for you to like the characters, they are serial killers hunting bad people. They only kill bad people because you don't want to be too unlikable. So the 2 serial killers run into each other while trying to kill the same person and sort of start leaving each other. The concept of the book was pitched to me as like they leave each other like messages in their kills and they fall in love and blah, blah, blah. If that concept isn't for you, that's fine. But I went into this book knowing that concept was absolutely for me. You know what that reminded me of in like concept wise was This Is How You Lose the Time War. 2 people doing the same job but on opposite, like not working together, leaving each other messages and clues through their work. That was what I wasn't expecting the same type of writing, but I was expecting like a silly romance with a same kind of concept. And I was expecting 2 serial killers, so 2 badasses like working together, working against each other. I was expecting like a little bit of gore, a little bit of violence. I was expecting a kind of a good romance. Why was this just like I don't even know how to describe it. It was just like your classic everyday toxic romance repackaged with like fun serial killer vibes, serial killer letters. The girl, despite being a serial killer, was completely helpless, and they kept throwing, the author kept writing in scenes where the main male character was like saving her from random situations that she should be a capable serial killer. She shouldn't have to be saved from. They basically fall in love instantly, and they're constantly in communication. There's no like subtlety, like little hidden messages. They are just always texting each other, and they basically get together like 40% of the way through the book, and that's that. Like, not only was that part really annoying, but the part that bothered me more than anything is, like, if you're gonna write a romance with like a power dynamic with a really weak, like meek female main character and a really strong, like tough guy love interest, then don't pretend like it's some sort of feminist girl boss story that you're writing. Don't pretend that like, oh my god, she's a serial killer, she's so badass. If you just want to write about your classic romance dynamic where she is crying in every single scene. And I'm like, I thought this girl was supposed to be awesome and tough and cool. And also, this book's greatest weakness was the fact that it was dual POV, which normally doesn't bother me, although every single dual POV book I have read has bothered me, because who wants to be in this male main character's head? Literally no one. The main male character, Rowan, is such just like a grade A asshole, and I can't stand him. I can't stand that the author tried to pretend that he was anything more than just a grade A asshole. Every single one of his perspective chapters are so unnecessary because it's just him talking about, oh my god, Sloane's boobs. Sloane's boobs are amazing. Sloane's boobs are so great. I love her boobs. And like just talking about her body, and like, oh my god, I can't wait to fuck Sloane. She's so, and I'm like, I hate this man. I hate this man with every fiber of my being. Why do we need his perspective? Because from Sloane, it's almost like it's so underhand, because from Sloane's perspective, the female main character's perspective, Sloane is like, I love him because he's such a good person. Like he has all these like great values. Like she values him for so many reasons. And we could pretend, if we were just in Sloane's head, that Rowan likes her for those reasons too. But when we're in Rowan's head, it's clear that he literally only likes her because he's sexually attracted to her. And it's just, I don't want to be in that kind of male main character's head. I really, really don't. God, I feel like my voice is not strong enough to convey how much this book irritated me back in May. And also, to be fair, I read it back in May, so my irritation has like died down a little bit. I'm like summoning it back up now. But yeah, the audiobook narrators were incredible. They had this man with this amazing Irish accent do voice Rowan. And the first chapter in his voice, I was like, I love this guy's voice. And then they just wasted it on like potentially my least favorite character of the year. What brought this book down from like just 2 stars, just didn't like it, like was just bad, to 1 star was the fact that the author like pretended like this was girl power, girl boss main character, and then just uses her as a vessel for the male main character's sexual desires. And that is her main role in the book, is to be the sex object for the male main character. Just my least favorite thing that happens in romance books. It's always a risk when you read like female male romance of that happening. And every time I read it, it's just like, it makes me want to give up on the genre as a whole. But obviously I didn't. I read a lot of romance this year. Yeah, massive ick from this romance. I don't understand how it has so many ratings. I understand why people read dark romance, but I thought, I don't mind dark romance when it's being honest about what it is. Like, this is a toxic main character, this is a toxic love interest. I don't think this book was meant to be that. It was meant to be like 2 toxic serial killers working together. They're both toxic, but it wasn't. It was just an asshole male main character, just like any asshole love interest you could get in any Kindle Unlimited romance. So, not worth this many ratings. Not worth the time I read it. Low-key worth the audiobook if you're going to read it at all, even just to hate on it. The audiobook narrators were incredible. I'll give them that. But they couldn't save this book for me. So, yeah. I gave it like 1 star, and the 1 star is for the audiobook narrators and them alone. Okay, we started off in a long rant, but I'm getting myself warmed up here. Another book I read this year that I thought was so overrated. Now that I'm looking at the actual reviews, I'm like, is this book overrated? I felt like I saw this book everywhere. I felt like I saw everyone talking about this book, and then I read it and it was horrendous. And that is God Killer by Hannah Kaner. It only has 40,000, if only, that's still a lot, 40,000 ratings, but it is at a slightly lower than average rating at 3.88. So maybe it's not that highly rated, but this book still pissed me off, so I'm gonna talk about it anyways. I just hated it. I gave it 2 stars because like there is some character that I like. There is some things going on that I like. This book is basically about a very poorly constructed and thought out world, by the way, where gods have been like banished from the world. People are no longer want to worship gods, so they're trying to hunt them down and kill them. They're very highly disliked. And there are gods for basically anything. There's gods of like every single concept you could think of has a god for it. So they're all over the place. And the main character is hunting down and killing gods. The other main character is a young girl whose family was just all wiped out by religious zealots. And then the third main character is a god himself, a god of white lies, who binds himself to the little girl who's just lost her family. That's where my problem comes in. I hated the god character in this book. I don't know if I can explain that properly. He's a god of white lies called Sketty. He's like a little creature. He was supposed to be all cutesy and he hops around, and he was just so manipulative and evil, and I cannot believe that he gets some sort of like redemption arc within 2 chapters of them discovering that he has been manipulating the mind of this young girl, convincing her to do whatever he wants. And the author just goes like, oh, but he's just a silly little god. He can't help it. He's just manipulating people's minds. What pissed me off more than anything else is this book could have been like a 4-star read. I loved Kissin and Adara and the love interest guy, and I liked the little quest and the found family vibes that the author was going for. But I refuse to accept any found family in which Sketty, this god, is a part. He is so, I don't understand. He gets a perspective chapter from the author, which is supposed to, show that he means well. He really means well. But the author doesn't seem to understand, that no one wants to read about a character constantly twisting the minds of the people around him who gets no consequence for it, who it's not seen as, that big of a deal, that he's altering the emotions of the people around him and playing with them like they're puppets for his will, which could have been such a great concept. Without context, if you've never read this book, that seems like such a great concept, right? A found family group that they think they all are friends, but one of them is secretly manipulating all their minds and is actually the villain. But he's not written as the villain. He's written as just oh, so silly of him to forget that he's not allowed to just force people to do whatever he wants. I don't know what Hannah Kaner was thinking. I don't know why she thought anyone would like this character. And he is the sole reason I rated it so low. The book was average overall. I probably would have given it 3 stars or 4 stars. 4 stars for concept, 3 stars for execution, 1.5 stars for Sketty. I hated him. Hate his character. If you hate characters in books who do bad things and don't get any sort of comeuppance for it, don't get any sort of retribution, you'll hate this book. I don't recommend. Okay, my next overrated book is a little bit of a hot take, but all of these books are hot takes, so we persevere. My next overrated book is a sequel to a duology. It's Two Twisted Crowns by Rachel Gillig. I know. It has 250,000 ratings on Goodreads approximately, with a 4.42 average star rating. And I don't know why. I gave it a very generous 2.5 stars, but how much this book pissed me off, it probably could have been rated lower. If I had just picked this book up on my own goodwill, just randomly seeing it, being oh, that's a pretty cover, let me read it. This duology, that is, The One Dark Window and Two Twisted Crowns, if I had just picked them up on my own will, I maybe would have given them 3-4 stars each with no like backdrop. I'm like, oh, a silly little YA romantasy. That's fine. 3-4 stars. But this book series was so hyped up by people online. People online were saying that this is like perfect atmospheric fantasy. They were comparing it to like The Bear and the Nightingale, which I really loved. And like the vibes are so great, and it just like is the perfect atmosphere with like this giant, and if you really like this monster in this girl's head that's like, and that kind of like magic system, you'll really love this, and unique magic systems, you'll really love this. I just don't get it. I rated the first book upon first read. I rated it like 4 stars because I was like, yeah, I guess I see what people are talking about. This was pretty good. It read really easily, the first book. The second book, we are stuck with this romance that I just did not care about whatsoever. Like, the main character of book 1 is still in book 2, but her sister, who's like emotionless, is getting this romance with this other side character, which annoyed me. The main romance between the main character, oh, what's her name? Elspeth. The main character between Elspeth and Raven, with a Y, they kind of just like were running after each other, doing the exact same thing over and over and over again. And while the magic system was cool, I'll give it that, I just feel like it wasn't as like beautifully written as everyone online was saying it was. It just is a standard YA romantasy. It really was not the best fantasy book of the year. It really was not like some sort of standout for me. Obviously, once again, when we're talking about controversial books, I'll remind myself, this is just for me. I read this duology at the same time as my best friend, and we have very similar takes about pretty much everything that we read and like. And we both agreed the first book was like, yeah, this was pretty good. It was decent. Like, we both read through it pretty fast. And the second book just ruined the duology for us. Like, she went back and changed her rating from 4 stars to 3 stars for the first book, because the second book made her realize all the things that annoyed her about the first book and like broke her out of the spell and made us realize that like, no, people online don't know what they're talking about. This book is not for us. Like, we do not like this book. So yeah, I really don't get the hype for this series. It is so many special editions. People talk about it so much, but it's just a very standard fantasy. The author isn't really doing anything crazy with the character relationships or the character dynamics. It's just, there's just like a lot of tropes in it, and like not done extra specially well. They're just kind of there to remind you that you're reading a YA fantasy trope book, and you're like, okay, yeah, I get it. I didn't need the reminder. It's fine. And it ended up kind of just feeling like blend of every single contemporary young adult romance I've read in terms of like the conflict and everything. And especially I was reminded of that in Two Twisted Crowns, which is why that's the book that's on this list, because One Dark Window was fine, but in Two Twisted Crowns, you get 2 of these young adult relationships that are based on literally nothing at all other than mutual attraction. And you're kind of like, why do these people like each other? They never have conversations with each other. Or these characters, like a lot of YA romances, they'll have like one conversation with each other, and then we'll be like, okay, well, now it's established that they like each other, so let's move on with the plot. You can't just establish that 2 characters are in love with each other after one conversation. It doesn't work like that. I'm not attached to the relationship. I don't care. I just felt like these books were too overhyped. For me, that's like, this is an overhyped, underhyped. That doesn't mean it's not still a decent book. It's nowhere near as bad as like Butcher and Blackboard or even Godkiller. It just, the high expectations of how that this would be incredible fantasy just left me disappointed, I'll say. My next 2 overrated books are both nonfictions, and I'll talk about them pretty quickly. One of them was a book I read in November. So I talked about that in my November recap, and that was The Wager by David Gran. I love a good nonfiction audiobook. This one was just boring, but it has 150,000 ratings with a 4.18 star average. So people love this and think it's super interesting. And I read it and I was like, I could have written this. It just talks about like all the very standard parts of shipwrecks in the 1700s, all the very standard aspects of living in that era, like, oh, they all got sick because none of them have health care and none of them have medicine, and they didn't know what scurvy was. And I'm like, yeah, that happens. I bet that happens. I could have told you that happened. Like, I read enough like pirate books when I was a middle schooler to tell you that happens. and it just felt super like underexplained. I just didn't get the hype because it was like very, very talked about in like nonfiction spaces when I was looking up like good nonfiction books that came out recently. The audiobook narrator was okay. The book was okay. As I said in my November review, it should have been an hour-long podcast episode. It should have been an hour-long history podcast episode. If The Rest is History did a podcast episode on this story, I'd find it really interesting, really cool. I would love that. It did not need to be like an 8-hour-long audiobook. There was not enough to talk about with this shipwreck, especially when the author goes into it revealing that people make it back alive from the journey. So just like spoiling the whole point of why you read a shipwreck book, which is like to know whether or not they get back alive. And the author just puts it down in the first chapter like, yeah, some of them make it back. There's this whole court case. We'll get there. And then we just have to like read the entire beginning of the part of the book that has much fewer stakes because we know a lot of the important people that are being introduced that are important to the narrative are going to get through fine. So that it's like, why am I reading this? Yeah, it just was not very compelling, did not hook me, too overhyped. My final like really overrated book, I have a couple of like honorable mention overrated books, but my final really overrated book of the year was Say Nothing by Patrick Radden Keefe with 125,000 ratings and a 4.47 star average. I give it 2 stars. If you have heard of this book, you may be shocked by this rating. If you've not heard about this book, you might just be like, okay, it's a bad nonfiction. It's not a bad nonfiction. It was written really well and pretty decently, and it is very, very popular, and it talks about a very important time in history. I just wasn't a fan of the way that Radden Keefe talks about the conflict. And maybe it was because I read this a month after I had been in Dublin, after I had visited Ireland, and I had been visiting a couple museums about specifically the Troubles, but also like Irish independence and how important Irish independence was for the Irish, and just like the long, long history of brutality that the Irish suffered under the English for like 800 years, the starvation and the struggles that they all went through because of the English, and therefore how important Irish independence is from a historical perspective. And Radden Keefe didn't seem to want to talk about any of that perspective at all. The most like perspective he talks about like pre-Troubles in this book, because he's talking about like the period of, I think he's talking about 1960s, 1970s to present day, specifically in Irish history. And he doesn't really offer a lot of context as to why Irish Republicans want independence, why they're willing to commit the violence that they are going to, the long history that precedes their actions. Radden Keefe doesn't seem to like want to talk about any of that, which made it a little bit odd for me because I knew about that, so I had that sort of context, and I just felt like he struck like a really weird tone in terms of justifying the military brutality shown by the British officers in Northern Ireland while not offering the same justifications for the brutality committed by the Republicans, like the IRA. So yeah, I just felt like a somewhat biased perspective, and then I just remember being so mad when I finished this book, and I was like, that was kind of I didn't really like the tone he took in some spots, and I searched it up, and Radden Keefe's not Irish. He did not grow up in Ireland. He is Irish American. And then I put the whole perspective of the book under like a new lens for me. There's a part in this book where he says, oh yeah, Irish Americans are almost more Irish than the Irish. And I'm like, that was kind of a weird thing to say, but okay, I guess that's like a funny joke if you're Irish. He's not Irish. He's Irish American. And I'm like, that doesn't stop a person from being able to write a book, but it did sour my perspective on Radden Keefe's perspectives, because I'm like, I guess like if this is the perspective he has in the conflict, that's so fair. That's his perspective. And then I realized he wasn't even Irish. And I'm like, okay, well then I just have no interest in your perspective and your personal opinions on this conflict. Yeah, this book pissed me off. It offers a lot of cool historical information if you don't know anything about the Troubles. It gives a lot of interesting historical facts about it, but in a somewhat biased way that I did not appreciate. Other overrated books I read this year. Those are my main ones. Other ones, I would say, okay, this is low-key, very low-key. Don't come for me. If you've heard of An Ember in the Ashes by Sabaa Tahir, this may come as a massive hot take. I think I might have just grown out of the age demographic that this series is for, that this is a YA fantasy series. So people hyped it up as like this incredible epic fantasy, incredible world building, and I went into it and I was like, it reads a little young, just for me, for what I was expecting. You know, if I know a book is a YA book going in, like for example, what was it called? Once Upon a Broken Heart. I knew it was gonna be a reading on the younger side of YA book. So I went in expecting a silly good time, and it was a silly good time. With An Ember in the Ashes, I was expecting like, some more like gritty, serious fantasy, because that's how people describe it. And it just felt like the author was just killing off every single side character for the sake of like being like gritty and dark fantasy, because everyone dies and like no one is safe except for every single main character that you actually care about. They're all going to be safe. None of them are going to die, obviously. And then you're kind of like, well, then where are the stakes in this story? So I was just a little bit disappointed by that book, but I still gave it 3 stars. So it's not, I think it's overhyped for what it is. People talk about it in the wrong way online, and I got the wrong impression of it, but I didn't think it was bad. I just talked for so long. God help me. But now we get into the category I was really actually excited to talk about. I was really happy to talk about. And that is my most underrated books of 2024. These were actually kind of harder to pinpoint. In previous years, I'd read a lot more books that were super underrated, but this year I got really into booktube, so a lot of the books I was reading are actually like pretty decently rated. That's one of my goals for 2025, is to get back into reading like more niche fiction again. But there were a couple that I did pick up that I wanted to shout out. First of all, this should be apparent if you've ever watched any videos on my channel, but anything by Rivers Solomon is underrated. They have 4 books published, I think. My favorite being Sorrowland has only 13,000 ratings and only a 3.83 star rating. I gave it 5 stars. I love the way that Rivers Solomon writes about like gender and queerness. Sorrowland is a sci-fi series. I talk about this in my top books of the year, so I won't go into a ton of detail, but Sorrowland is a sci-fi book about a person escaping a cult who is undergoing changes because of something to their body, because of something the cult did to them. So it has like these body horror aspects to it as well, that I thought was so interesting and so well written, and deals with race and gender and fungal science fiction in like a really cool way. I just love all of River Solomon's characters, the way that they write like these really like warm feeling characters that are really struggling with life, but still just feel so strong and amazing, and I love them. Model Home, their newest book, only came out in October. It only has 2,500 ratings, a 3.84 star average. So I need more people to read Model Home because it's amazing. And I love everything that River Solomon writes. So I don't know who is rating these so low. Maybe people who pick them up and it's like not for them. But if you like queer fiction, read River Solomon. I love their books. They're amazing. So, so good. Another book that I found surprisingly underrated when I was looking at star ratings, this year was my year of memoirs. I got really into reading a lot of memoirs. Some reading, but mostly audiobook. But I started the year with one memoir that I loved, that I read the physical version of, not the audiobook. And it's called They Called Us Exceptional and Other Lies That Raised Us by Prachi Gupta, that sort of tackles the model minority myth, talking about Prachi's life growing up and her relationship with her family and her Indian family background, and how that affects the way that she encounters racism in the United States, and how her family encounters racism in the United States, and how they dealt with it, and how their family dynamics suffered as a result. And I just thought it was such a well-written book. I'm like such a sucker for sibling relationships. So the way that like Prachi writes about her relationship with her brother just like had me sobbing my eyes out. I remember I was reading this walking on a treadmill in like a public gym, and I had to like go to the bathroom because I was like crying while walking on the treadmill. I was like, this book is killing me. It only has 6,115 ratings but it has a 4.36 star average. So people like it, and you will like it too. I gave it 5 stars. I think this hits so hard, especially if you grew up in an immigrant community in the US, and I really highly recommend. It's so underrated. Yeah. My next book was on my top books of 2024 list, so I won't go into a ton of detail, but that is The Spirit Bares Its Teeth by Andrew Joseph White. This book has been out for long enough that it should have more than 11,000 ratings, okay? It has a 4.49 average, which should tell you how good it is. So that means that but it only has 11,000 ratings, which means there's plenty of people out there who haven't read it yet, and you need to read it. It is a YA kind of horror Victorian fantasy book. There's a lot of genres going on in Andrew Joseph White's books, which I love about them, because it's a really great way to introduce YA audiences to a range of genres. So he introduces like horror, there's fantasy, and like they can talk to spirits of the dead in this book. The main character is a trans boy. I think he's pretty young in this book. I think he's like 14, 15. But he's a trans boy called Silas, whose parents are trying to marry him off. But he does not want to be married off, obviously, because he wants to be a surgeon and he wants to be seen in the eyes of society as a man. So his family instead ships him off to an asylum to turn him into a bride for someone so that they can breed necromancers, basically. And this asylum has some conspiracies and some horrible things happening that he bonds together with the girls there to like discover and take down the asylum. And it's so heartwarming, like found family vibes amongst the people in the asylum and the gardener at the asylum and like the girls that are stuck there with him. And yeah, I talk about this more in other videos, so I won't go into a ton of depth, but this book should be like a staple of queer YA reading. Maybe people don't read enough queer YA books overall, but I was like so emotional. I could not believe it was YA, because although it's written for a YA audience for sure, but it's so emotionally deep for YA, and I was really impressed by that overall. This next book is actually underrated because I haven't even talked about it on this channel before. So it's underrated even by me in terms of I loved it so much that I can't believe I don't talk about it more. That is Angels Before Man by Raphael Nicolas. This book only has 4,400 ratings with a 4.14 star average. It's a pretty niche recommendation. I don't think everyone on earth would love it, but I did. It has a lot of, what do people call it? Purple prose? Blue prose? Yellow prose? Whatever it's called. That is like very ornate, flowery language, sometimes unnecessarily, but it matches the vibe of this book because this is a queer retelling of Lucifer's fall from heaven that basically begins when Lucifer is made as an angel and then continues until his fall and like the events that lead up to it. And it's just I just remember it was so beautiful writing. The second book I didn't like so much. It was still the same beautiful writing, but it was just a little bit too much of it. And I wasn't as attached to any of the characters in the second book compared to how attached I was to Lucifer in book one, because the first part is like coming of age novel. So you get really attached to him as he's like growing and like learning to understand what being in existence is, building relationships with the other angels. It's a beautiful story where he is told from birth that he is the most beautiful, the most beloved, the most important. And then when you're at that high, the only place to go is down. The only way to go is to fall. And I just thought it was so well written for that. And the author clearly cares about religious lore a lot. I don't know a lot about it, but I thought it was really beautifully written. And I think more people should read it and more people should talk about it because I think people would like it. If you liked like If You Lose the Time War or just like queer coming of age books overall, I think you would enjoy this. And I think more people should read it. It only has 4,400 ratings and it's a beautiful cover. Beautiful. And then the last book/series I want to talk about for this video of an underrated book/series is The Burning Kingdoms. I've talked about this series a lot on this channel recently because I just finished the last book that came out, The Lotus Empire. But it's still underrated. I still think that the epic fantasy of this series is so interesting. The political intrigue in book 2 and 3 really picks up. So if you read book 1 and it wasn't necessarily for you, like that like kind of fantasy adventure doesn't really sit with you, keep reading. The political intrigue in book 2 and 3 is so sick and well written, and incredibly written main romance. I love it. It really ties the series together. It's sapphic fantasy. South Asian inspired mythology fantasy. If you like fantasy books, if you like romance fantasy, read The Jasmine Throne, read The Oleander Sword, and then read The Lotus Empire, because so good. The last book is the underrated book in the series that I'm talking about, that counts for this video. It has only 1,437 ratings so far, but it's only been out for 2 months. But it has a 4.44 average, so I'm sure there's a lot of people who have shelved it who haven't gotten around to it yet because it just came out. It has good reviews. You should get around to it if you haven't yet. Get on the hype. But yeah, my underrated section was much shorter because some of them were already in my favorite books video, and this is mostly a video for me to talk about the overrated books in the end. But if you want to talk about more underrated books, or if you want more suggestions for books that aren't as heavily talked about on this platform, but I think are really good. Another example maybe would be like Red Sister. If you want to hear me talk about Red Sister, you can watch my top books of 2024 video. It was an honorable mention. Yeah, there's a lot of great books out there that aren't necessarily discussed as much, and my goal in 2025 is to read more of them, because now I'm finally caught up, I feel like, with the booktube canon, so I can explore myself a little bit more. Overall, I wouldn't be turned off from reading any of the overrated books if they are on your list. They just didn't work for me. They really didn't. As you can tell, a lot of those rants were kind of personal. Like, I was like, this specific thing annoyed me. So there can also be personal reasons why you would love those books. Absolutely. But I will leave it there. I hope you had an amazing 2024 with more underrated books than overrated books. And hopefully next year my underrated section can be 30 minutes long and my overrated section can be the shorter section for this video. But we will hope for the best. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!